Make paradox your practice. The concept that I think is so important is that paradoxes and ambiguity and incongruity they're not things that are to be worked through for change. They are the change. They are the essence of the change. And if you don't have ambiguity, paradox, or incongruities, you're not changing.
Hello to you. It's Relationships at Work, a leadership podcast helping you build workplace connection, improve culture, and avoid blind spots. I am the host of the show, Russel, a communications and leadership expert. A couple of successful decades in both those areas under my belt, and a whole heap of curiosity, just like yourself. That's why you're here, on how we can make the workplace a better place. You know what doesn't make work easy? Conflict. It's around every corner. It can be really tough sometimes. Things don't always go smoothly, and there's always an opportunity for it. And it's one of the biggest challenges I think leaders face, because a lot of them want to avoid it. It's hard. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't feel good. If we don't do anything, maybe it'll go away. We tell ourselves that in the back of our heads. It's one of the biggest roadblocks, I think, for leaders to really have a good ecosystem, a good culture of leadership. Really challenging. But what if? What if conflict was actually the secret to opportunity, to innovation? What if we as leaders actually embraced conflict in a creative way that actually improved our relationship with our teams and the culture that we work in? What if? Well, my guest today, he's done a bit of work around this, wrote a couple of books around it, and he's going to tell us exactly what we can do to embrace conflict to lead towards better innovation. Hold on. And on the show today, we have Jeff DeGraff, and here is why he is awesome. Jeff is an advisor to Fortune 500 companies, top speaker on innovation, a professor at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan, and he's founder of Innovatrium. His thoughts on innovation are covered by Inc., Fortune, Psychology Today, lots of others. He's written several books, including Leading Innovation and Innovation U, and he's written a couple recently with his partner Stanny, his DeGraff, which includes The Innovation Code, The Creative Power of Constructive Conflict, and The Art of Change, Transforming Paradoxes into Breakthroughs. And their latest, like I said, the man writes, the latest is The Creative Mindset, Mastering the 6 Skills That Empower Innovation. And he's here. Hello, Jeff.
Russell, thanks for having me on.
Thrilled to have you here. I love the Michigan represent hat there for you there, sir. Nicely played. We're getting into adaptability to opportunity, which is how do we prepare? Well, you know what? I'm going to get you to define it. We're not there yet. But before we kick all this off, I have to ask you the question I ask all my guests, Jeff, which is, what, sir, is your best or worst employee experience?
Well, I want to give you both, if you will. So the best, I was asked about a number of years ago to help save a venerable English institution, Reuters, the big news organization. And what we did was we worked with a bunch of employees at Reuters to come up with an experience that was really remarkable. And so we rented an old lorry warehouse, a truck warehouse, brought everybody in from the organization, the key people, if you will. So it's like 100 people. And we said, we have to rebuild this thing. And a lot of people, I think, came intending to quit. It was very kind of interesting because it was really a perilous situation. And at the end of all of this very participative, seemed like chaos. How are we going to rebuild this thing? The employees, not only the 2 or 3 employees that told me they were going to quit, not only didn't quit, the employees decided to buy an enormous amount of Reuters stock. And it became the beginning of the transformation. And the postscript is kind of interesting because Reuters eventually became acquired by Thomson, the Canadian company. And ironically, they took the CEO of the acquired company, Reuters, and made him the CEO of both Thomson and Reuters, thus saving Reuters. The people who were in Reuters decided how they were going to make the change happen. It was very empowering. It was a very good moment in time. Now, the other side, I was brought in by a group of people for a healthcare organization, which I will not name. And it became sort of the opposite. It became kind of arguments, negligence, and the entire sort of bringing everybody together just turned out to be chaos and a lot of finger pointing. And so sort of the key is when you bring a lot of people together, how do you get them synced up? How do you get them around a shared vision? And in the second case, I brought a group in and the person who was kind of in charge just was a real negative Nelly, if you will. And so it wasn't, we're going towards something. It was all the things that were wrong with the world. So that was my best day, if you will. And my worst day, there's probably hundreds others because I don't do so much work in this space that kind of fall into both categories.
So, from those lessons learned, even though you don't do that work anymore, how did either of those change your approach to organizations like that? Because you went in there where one culture was obviously pretty healthy, pretty supportive, and the other one not so much. Did it affect how you approach those relationships moving forward?
Yeah, in full disclosure, I've been in over half of all the Fortune 500. I've done thousands of these in my career. The challenge is this. Here's what affects me. In all of these situations, there needs to be a person who serves like an impresario at the opera. You need to find the person who has credibility with everyone, has a sense of doing the right thing, sort of above their own self-interest, if you will. That's certainly true. But I want to add to that a really silly thing that I think most people overlook, which is, do they create energy? I mean, I'm sounding very kind of new agey here, which is a little uncomfortable for me. But are they able to create energy? And because that creates momentum, and energy and momentum is always moving forward. And that really did affect me. And it's affected me my whole career. I look for that. And I've got a lot of stories about, I was Steve Jobs' advisor when I was young. And we could talk about sort of people who are good at that. And the other side is the people who just have a lot of, I call them black holes. They suck all the energy out, people who do that. And you kind of have to be very careful about who's at the center of these communities.
Fair enough. And sometimes as you're coming in to work with them, you have no control over that. And you have to work with those people regardless of what they're giving you or not giving you in those situations, for sure.
Absolutely true.
Adaptability seems like one of those positive attributes that organizations, and I guess, there could be a negative side to adaptability too. But before I go down that rabbit hole, I'm kind of curious to your way of thinking, Jeff. How do you define adaptability? Because we're going to go down the conversation of adapting to opportunity.
Yeah.
How would you
Yeah.
even define the phrase?
Yeah. I would say it's a funny thing. I would say there's a high tolerance of ambiguity, incongruity, and paradox. And what that means is, in a world where you know that X marks the spot, that's basically project management. And I come from my doctorate's in what we would now call artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is going to take all those jobs like that. And it already is. So look at what's happened with the software industry. Anybody's a programmer, a packet switcher, network person, they're hemorrhaging these jobs because X marks the spot can be done better by a machine. So the notion of adaptive thinking is what I'm really talking about, is how do I think through an ambiguous situation? So let me give my favorite example. Innovation is what we call in business school, this is a business school term, is a convex form of value. And what it means is it pays in the future. And why that's important is there is no data on the future. And the number one form of resistance to innovation is excessive data collection, right? Your listeners will know they've been to the meeting about the meeting. They've seen the report about the report. You're stuck in the planning cycle. You're terrified of ambiguity, right? So the notion is it's not that you don't do research and it's not that you don't plan. It's that what's happening is you have to make real-time adjustments. So your strategy, the minute you start, you have to adjust. So let me give you a real good example. Go back and look at your 2019 strategy, any of your listeners to their organizations. Well, we had a pandemic, right? That wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And the real question becomes, how did you navigate through a pandemic? And people will go with that. Well, that was a very unusual thing. No. Read Thucydides, read Herodotus, read the Bible. Pandemics happen all the time. Go back in our own history, whether it was the Spanish flu or polio or whatever, things are always happening like this. So the notion is we make plans. And then our problem is when we get disconfirming feedback cognitively, we're unable or we're paralyzed, we're afraid to adjust.
And maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but I'm trying to figure out the divide between adaptive thinking and just reacting to change.
Adaptive thinking is more than just reactive. Adaptive thinking is actually forward. It's proactive. You're sensing. There's a term that my colleague at Columbia, Rita McGrath, coined called discovery-driven strategy. And it's a really nice term. And my mentor, Bob Quinn, calls this building the bridge as you walk over it. So it's not reacting to the world. It's being in a high awareness state of what's happening to you and where what you had planned to have happen isn't going on. And again, there's where this issue is extremely important. And the things that I work on is, for example, in the military, because if you're not adaptive, that things don't end well, or in the operating room, right, where surprises are part of the normative behavior, if you will. You're going to always have surprises. Now, of course, that's an extreme example, but on a regular basis, we have a lot of examples like that. You turned in the report and you were expecting it was going to be well. You thought you're going to get a good grade, and it wasn't. So the question becomes not the reaction, but were you aware of what was possible? And do you have the facility to actually adjust, to make mid-course corrections to it? That's the key.
So, apologize for my bluntness here. Why do we need to? Because, there's many organizations that are not like this. They'll be more leaning into we reacted well, checkbox, moving on, right? As opposed to what you're talking about of adaptive thinking. What is the benefit to leaders to have this approach versus the just going with the flow?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd put it to you this way. If the world turns out to be the way you planned it to be, what's called good continuation, then your innovations are incremental and anybody can do them, and any fool will, right? The notion is the more variant your anticipatory maneuvers, the more variant your responses are, the more likely, the more valuable, or the more innovative your organization is going to be. And in a world where the speed and magnitude of change is greatly increased, right? All of our old theories, Schumpeter's scale and all the stuff that we learned in business school, those things are getting thrown out the door because of inflection points. And it's almost become banal when people talk about this is the greatest period of change. Well, today is always the greatest period of change. You're a farmer in Lyon, France in the 14th century, and the Crusades come back through your town and 2/3 of your town dies of the Black Plague. Well, that's the biggest period of change. And I will say that the inflection point that we're going through now, really AI, which we've been waiting for since the 90s. We haven't seen an inflection point like this since the real tech revolution in the mid-90s. So it's not just AI, it's what's happening with clean energy, it's what's happening with bioengineering, which is going to be the huge one. If you think about Jennifer Doudna, who won the Nobel Prize for, mRNA technology, and you think about how before last Christmas, we basically mapped all 200 million human proteins, this is kind of scary stuff. We're able to do stuff that I'm not sure morally we're prepared for. But the point I'm trying to make is in times of these inflection points, right? The highly adaptive, sorry to sound like Darwin here, the highly adaptive are the ones who are going to survive. And let me give you one example that your listeners will get. Think about all the big tech companies and how when COVID hit, they had the best strategies, they planned everything, and they all got caught with their pants down, right? They were out of chips. This platform, the big platforms collapsed first couple of days. This little company called Zoom, which basically didn't have a great strategy, but they had a very adaptive business model. They're the ones that won big, right? And the people that had all the best strategic planning in the world are the ones that lost big. And that's a perfect example of where we're at.
Then are we looking at everything as an opportunity? You've talked a bit about hugely negative events, COVID, Black Plague, but also possibly horrible and or fantastic events, AI, disruption, and this sort of thing. So if we're adaptive leaders, are we looking at everything as an opportunity, or are we looking to survive certain situations? Like,
I
what
think
is
it's the
opportunity?
answer is both.
Okay.
I think great innovators are constantly, they have two things that are very interesting. And I think it certainly reflects my own personality. So I'm projecting here. One, you have to be dissatisfied with just about everything. This doesn't work as well as it should. This isn't the way this should work. So there's a part of me that goes around and thinks about how I'd redesign everything. Right. But the other part is you have to have this incredibly optimistic, only almost naive sense of destiny. So I'm certainly part of that. And I'm part of that generation that went to the moon and made miracle drugs and built the net. I'm part of that generation. Okay, boomer, right? But that was part of what we did, right? And you can see both aspects in the extreme in my generation. You see the sense that, technology will solve all of our problems, and the other sense, the reactionary sense that the world's going to end tomorrow. But to me, a great example of this would be, AI is leading to, where people are just cutting and pasting, but it will also lead to, the ability for nuclear power actually to be responsible nuclear power, because it needs to support AI, but it will also create a lot of clean energy, right? And that will lead to what? That will lead to, all kinds of people in the world who disempowered or maybe underutilized will have opportunities that they don't have today. So there's always, this is sometimes referred to as Russell, as the axe maker's dilemma, right? And what it means is the axe can be used to do something really wonderful, farming, build a house, but it can also be used for negative things. And that's unfortunately the human condition. The more we innovate, the the better things get, but also the other things happen as well.
Do we maybe have to shift our thinking around what failure means then?
Yes. And there's two parts to this, and I have an axe to grind here.
I like your segue
There's
from axe to axe, but yes, go.
yeah, there's a lot of stuff written about, you know, you have to fail and everybody has to fail and all that. And I'm a champion wrestler. Got through college super fat. I mean, I want to win, right? So I hate failing. I hate it. So when people talk about failure is okay and it's all, I'm like, if failure is okay and you like to fail, then maybe you're a failure, right? But I think there's a second part to this, which is failure is part of it. All right. So I'm saying, yes, failure is absolutely part of everything we need to do. But I'm also saying you don't need to like it, right? I think there's this sense of destiny that we have to have, so that when you're failing, it's kind of like when you're at the gym and that you didn't weigh out at the right number and you couldn't quite bench press what you thought, right? So there's a part of that I'm not asking your listeners to think that's great, but there's another part saying that's part of the journey. And so when you go to the locker room and you sort of deal with this, you got to go, I got to come back tomorrow. I'm going to do better tomorrow. That wonderful sense of optimism that you need in order to be successful at this.
We're talking a lot about how internally we may have to rethink everything that we were raised, led, managed, trained. But there's this, and you talked on it, there's this need to resist things because we like to stay in our comfort. We like to stay with habit. So how can we adapt when our own mindset is basically going, I don't like change. There's already been too much change. And now you want them to completely change how they do everything.
Hey, if you're enjoying the insights from our guests, you'll love our Raw Notes newsletter. It's packed with guest takeaways, the resources that inspire them, and my own tips on how we as leaders can be better humans for the humans that we're responsible for. Go to relationshipsatworkshow.com and subscribe now and help the workplace be more human.
Now, I would like to start by admitting that I am a terrible hypocrite, as a lot of innovation people are. So I like to drive the same car I've driven since the early 2000s. I like to sit in the same seats at the stadium. I have a lot of non-change behaviors and can become extremely passive aggressive. when people try and push me out of things like that. So I would say, in one sense, you have to have one foot on something that's stable, right? Because we're human beings. But the other part of this, I would say, is notice when people really change, right? They don't really change when things are okay. They only really change twice. So think of it like a bell curve, right? They change within a crisis because the risk of trying something radical and the reward of staying where they're at is reversed. You're going through a divorce. You lose the job, you lose the house, somebody close to you passes away, you have a health issue. Well, why do people change when those things happen? Well, because risk and reward is reversed. It's the same reason that the first $1 trillion company, Apple, was trading below $5 a share in 1997. When you're almost dead, you take the safety off, right? I don't know how else to put it. The same is true when you're on a roll. We call this risk capital. When you're on a roll, the risk of trying something radical and the reward of staying where you're at is reversed. So, your company's, just got a huge contract. You just graduated. You're in love. Now, here's what your listeners need to understand. It's not the 80-20 rule. It's the 20-80 rule. It's easier to change 20% of your life 80% than it is to change 80% of your life 20%. Let me repeat that. It's easier to change 20% of your life 80% than it is to change 80% of your life 20%. We have it backwards. Yeah. And the issue is those areas of crisis or opportunity is where people change. So I'm coming back to, I don't like to change, right? But I find those places in my life where changing is appropriate, and I work from the outside in. And I think that's when we look at people, whether they're losing weight or getting the better job or getting through school, that's kind of how they do it. So the whole idea of going big or going home, I love the fact that most of those smart Alecks have gone home. That is not the way to do this.
Is there anything you'd recommend for leaders, for employees to really start embracing? So you're saying it's a baby step approach before we do burn bridges. Oh, you know what? I'm going to change the entire way I eat tomorrow, Jeff. I'm going to change, my entire way I approach my team tomorrow. Is it just getting comfortable with just minutia change? Is that before the big stuff comes?
I think I'm going to put it a little bit differently. Okay. If you think about how a venture capitalist who actually knows what they're doing, because half of them are completely clueless, and that's why they go away so quickly. Business school professors are allowed to say that. What a venture capitalist who's really successful will do is they'll look at, let's say, a disease state. Let's say they're looking in medicine. And they will invest in 4 or 5 companies, but a little bit of investment. We call this A round. I want you to think, your listeners to think of it like their life, where they're giving very little money or very little time to an experiment, but the experiment is quite radical. The experiment is quite different. So this is what we call hedging or differentiating. So what you're doing is you're creating a funnel. And at the top of the funnel, you're trying little things very quickly. And you're getting confirming or disconfirming feedback. You're getting reality, but you're creating momentum. You're creating momentum in your life. You're creating energy in your life. And very quickly, you're going to draw that down. And you're going to draw it down into the things that actually work. So think of it. The 5 small experiments become 2 bigger experiments. The 2 bigger experiments becomes one thing that you think you can actually do. Right. And that, to me, is a perfect example of how people actually change in a way that's highly productive.
How do you know it's working? Because it's great that we're doing this, but how do you know you're moving the needle, or you're just checking boxes to try to shift the needle for yourself?
Depends on what you consider valuable. I'm very much against the notion that, remember, innovation has to show itself. It has to be articulated in the world, but I'm very much against the notion that value is just money. I mean, it could be that you wrote the first chapter of a novel that you want to write, and you've been stuck on it for 3 years, and finally you got it where you want it to be. So you're getting momentum, you're getting confirming feedback that this is kind of the thing you wanted to produce. And a lot of times it's a surprise. It's better than you thought it would be, right? So I don't think confirming and disconfirming feedback has to come from the outside world. It's like the old, what they teach you in catechism. I'm an old Catholic, right? So that sometimes doing a good deed is its own reward. And I really think that one of the challenges we're having right now, which is, I think, really hard for people to understand. I think the big challenge right now is we're looking too much to everyone else, and we're not paying enough attention to our own inner compass, so that we let too many people in our head. So even on this wonderful podcast, I'd say, take take what resonates and get rid of the rest of it. Get people out of your head. That's why I go on these really long walks every day. And part of it is just to figure out what's worth keeping and what do I need to just kind of let go of.
It's one of the things that came up really quickly when I started the show was that it's called relationships with, relationships at work.
Mhm.
But very quickly, I learned the most important relationship you have is the one you have with yourself. The one,
Yeah.
that inner monologue, that inner conversation, that time you need to spend on your own, because you're not good to anybody else. And you're not making those strong decisions until you're right with you.
Yeah, I would even add to that
Mm.
around innovation. One of the trademarks of a classic innovator, and of course, everybody's different, and there's some variation, but what's called self-authorizing behavior. And that means that there's a compass inside your head, that sense of destiny, and you're going to start moving towards it. And the more that you socialize this with other people, and I think that that's important to do that, the more exposure you have to people trying to course correct for you. And the hardest part is really keeping true to that compass. What is it? So I'm not saying you should exclude people, and I'm certainly big on you need to listen to, but you shouldn't listen to everyone. You need to know who to listen to. And when something really resonates with you, it almost feels like a sign. I don't know how else to put that, but I'm on airplanes all the time. I'm one of those. I've just passed 2,500,000 miles on Delta, right? So I'm on airplane all the time. And I hear people all the time say, well, I put earphones on and I don't talk to anybody in the airplane. I talk to everybody in the airplane because you don't know where where you're going to get that nugget. And yeah, you have to wade through some chatty Cathy or whatever from, Minnesota wants to talk about the weather, whatever it is, right? You have to wade through that. And that's okay too. That's a good human skill. But somebody will add something, and that goes into that inner workings about self-authorized behavior. What can I do with that?
Want more from our conversations on the show? Subscribe to the Raw Notes newsletter. It's where I share top takeaways from our guests, the resources that fuel their success, and my personal insights on how we as leaders can be more human. And we need more human. Go to relationshipsatworkshow.com and sign up today to keep your leadership journey on the right path.
So I'm glad that you brought in the other. Maybe it's a team you work with, maybe it's your colleagues. How do you know they're the right people to support adaptability, to support innovation, to support this way of thinking, or they're worth avoiding? Because you said don't listen to everybody, but then what are we looking for?
In fact, one of the things that I'm known for, obviously, is this model, the competing values framework or the innovation code, which is actually, used from everything to how to build teams to predict stock prices, right? So my big contribution to this model was innovation is created through the creative power of constructive conflict. And it's a really funny thing because it's very contrary to what people say. So people look at the political environment and go, oh, the world's coming to an end. I'm like, no, when people disagree, there's constructive and destructive conflict. So I don't want to mix up the two. Constructive conflict is respectful. It's we respect other people, no prejudice, but all ideas are challenged, right? And this is what's supposed to happen at universities, for example. You're supposed to be having discussions, and the reason is constructive conflict produces generative hybrids. It produces better ways, new ways of doing things, right? And the interesting thing is when I go back to the beginning of my career, building Domino's Pizza was one of the things I did when I was really young, right? Well, for Tom Monahan, right? And one of the things I started noticing right away was what we call creativity clusters. These places that produce most of the intellectual property in the world, there's a lot of people and they have very different ideas. And these different ideas, these different worldviews are what we call dominant logic. These different dominant logics, when put together in a respectful, resourceful way, almost always produce outcomes. And that becomes the real argument, I think, for for diversity, particularly diversity of thought, right? Which comes from different human experiences, right? So it's kind of the human experiences are the key ingredient. So the object about this, when you talk about how do we deal with that at work, is I intentionally put these different kinds of people together. It's like a dinner party. You have to sit the people together who are respectful of each other, maybe admire each other, but have very different ideas, and then listen to the conversation, because that's where all the good stuff happens. The death of innovation is apathy. The death of innovation is over-alignment. That's project management. That's a day at the races, and anybody can do that, and the machines are going to be doing that. What we really want in this world is we want difference, but we want respectful difference. Does this make sense to you? So that's how I deal with it. How I pick people is I don't pick them individually. I pick how they go in the team. So think about like the Avengers, assemble the Avengers, right? They're all super powerful, have egos, are challenging people. And sort of the Avengers stories, all the movies are basically, they go like this. They were super good at something individually, and then something came into their life, a nemesis that was just too big for one of them. Then they go through this period of creating real trouble for each other. And I don't want to make it sound like they love each other, because they have issues, right? We all do. But eventually they figure out how to work together, and they build new ways of doing things. And so I really like that. My favorite movie out these days, which is of course controversial on this subject, is Oppenheimer. And if you look at the whole history of the project and dealing with the groups he had to deal with, you're getting a pretty good look at how it really looks. So your listeners, if they go watch Oppenheimer, you're getting a pretty good look of how you put these teams together, what they're really like, but what they're capable of producing. Now, of course, in that case, that's not something we want people to be producing, but it's a good case study.
I love that you got us to the atom bomb, Jeff. Nicely.
Sorry about that.
That's good.
Let's hope for nicer things. How about that?
But diversity is something I want to talk about, because we will have this team, we're building this team, but not everybody reacts the same way. And if you're talking about encouraging constructive conflict, there will still be people that I don't like conflict at all. They'll shut down. And
Absolutely.
it stops any innovation from happening because they're not being engaged in the way they prefer to be engaged. Do you approach them differently? Do you adjust?
You do.
Or do you say they just don't fit?
No, you approach them differently. I would say the way I like to put it, going back to my Avengers analogy, the most important Avenger is Nick Fury. He doesn't have any great, superpowers. What he is he manipulates and coalesces and negotiates, and he works like the impresario at the opera. He works with the divas to basically get them to work together. And some people are and this even happens generation-wise. It happens in different parts of the world. So I do a lot of work in Asia, like East Asia and Southeast Asia. They're not Americans. You can't deal with conflict that way. You have to pull conflict out in a much more subtle way. So you have to work with the idiom or the rituals or traditions of that culture. And I think it's particularly true in generations. So I'm a boomer. And boomers, we competed for everything. And we're in my model, what we call the compete quadrant, right? We still have Michigan grade on a curve, don't send your ducks to Eagle School. We have a lot of that kind of, energy. Go to the moon, damn it, right? That sort of stuff. Our children are not like that. Our children are the opposite. Our children are a collaborate culture people. It's how are we doing? And, and that I'm not making fun of it. I'm saying you have to talk to that generation. And of course, I'm generalizing here. You have to talk to generation differently. You have to be a little more nuanced. You can't be so direct. You have to talk to values as opposed to goals, right? The same is true for entrepreneurs who want to talk about vision. When you're going to talk to the people who actually are the contractors who have to build it, you have to talk about process. And again, in my work, I go into the details of this, but the key is exactly what you're saying. And that comes back to where we started this conversation. Your role as a leader is like being a game show host, right? You have to keep track of the game, and you have to keep track of the score, but your real job is to be working with the contestants so that they're engaged. They're all going to be different, so that they're creating energy, right? And that no one is kind of on their heels, right? That's the hard part. And if you think about being a parent, I have 3 kids. You don't raise your 3 kids the same way. They're all going to be different. And so each one kind of gets a variation of your parenting skills.
It lends to something that drives me nuts, which is when you'll see this online a lot. Like, what's your leadership style? And I'm like, if you have one leadership style, you're a horrible leader. You have to adapt based on who you're working with, who you engage with. Sometimes it's very domineering. Other times it's very collaborative. Other times it's very passive. But if you don't have all those,
I'm going to put a slight adjustment
please.
on that thing. I think leadership styles are like being right-handed or left-handed. And you can always tell what somebody really is by what they do when they're under stress, right? So, my leadership style under stress is very much that kind of invent your way out of it. But here's the point that I think is important. Some people have a lot of range. I don't. So what I do is I have a ensemble around me. I know who to go to. So I'll give you a great example. I built the Innovatrium. I'm the architect of the Intellectual Edge Alliance, 14 programs, 45 countries around the world. It's got to be one of the largest ecosystems in the world for innovation. I don't run it, right? I have other people run it. They're better at running it. I don't hire. There are people who are better at hiring. I'll give you a great example. I'm somebody who I can tell you immediately, this person is capable of this. What I can't tell you is whether they're going to do it or not. I never know why. And so part of it is being aware of what your superpower is and what it isn't. And then turning to somebody who has that superpower and going, I think this person would be great. And then they always come back and go, well, they're not going to do this because here's what's going on in their life. And I'm like, oh, right. That's a blind spot. So I hope this makes sense. You don't have to be in charge of a company or a big ecosystem. Just have friends. It's very funny. There's a lot of young people on my hallway here at the University of Michigan. And, they're in the phase of dating and figuring out kind of it's charming, right? But it's really interesting to see those people who are kind of going through this cycle where it's not working, right? And what's really charming is they'll have a friend, because the doctoral students are just across the street from me here, just across the hallway. They'll find a friend and they'll kind of get, what do you think of this? And sometimes when you listen in, the friend will have some information that's the blind spot for the person. And you'll go, okay, they're getting this. That's personally important to them. They're finding their person.
I love the idea of the friends idea of it, of just work with people you want to work with, like working with, enjoy working with. But that's always not the case. You don't get to choose a lot of the times. You are a leader that is assigned a team, or it's thrust upon you. Do you approach it differently if you're like, well, you can't be my friend?
You have to manage. I'm not, the friend word bothers me. I'm not sure we're supposed to be friends. I'm also not sure we're supposed to be happy. Again, this is the old Jesuit in me. What I'm sure is that we're supposed to make meaning, and we're supposed to be doing positive things in the world, right? Those are not interchangeable terms, right? So the whole idea of, the whole thing's about me being happy. I'm like, happy hours at 5:00 and take a cruise with your friends. I mean, that's just not for me, right? To me, meaningfulness is different. And everybody in the world has a ability, and I don't want to use the word disability, but a lack of ability in some areas. And so there's two parts to what you're saying, Russell, and I want to acknowledge them differently. The first part is there's always going to be somebody who doesn't have an ability that they should have to be here. And you have to manage to that by having other people support them, by you supporting them, by finding them additional resources, sometimes by putting them on the bench and managing around them, right? What is Bismarck's famous saying? Don't let other people's incompetencies become your failures, right? So you have to manage that. But I want to make sure that everybody understands you have to be kind about this, because we have skills and don't have skills that are just there. That's whether it's biological or a gift from God or whatever you believe about the world, that's not somebody's fault. On the other hand, there are very people who don't want to be into some situation and they're trying to sabotage a situation. In that case, there's kind of two things you can do. If you have power, the first thing you need to do is move them out. And I've had many conversations particularly with women who get into a senior position. There's some guy who's mad about it. And the first conversation you have is that person needs to go. And then there's this reticence. I'm just giving my real experience. It's not for everybody, but I've had this for I've been doing this for 40 years and saying you need to get rid of this person because they're going to do everything in their power to subvert you here. And so if you have power, it's just better. I do it in a humanitarian way, but move them along. Right. And that's my view. But the other part is when you don't have power, basically what you have to do is neutralize that person. And the way you do that is pretty simple. Negative people are almost always in the reactive position. They're going to tell you what's wrong with everything. And the way to solve that is to say, boy, that's a really good point. What would you do here? And when they actually come out, now they're exposed to a reactive position. Now you can attack, right? And so the notion is pretty quickly, you try and neutralize that person. Now remember, this is not for people who are genuinely involved. They're really trying. These are people who are trying to stop the group. I'm trying to build on what you're saying, being negative. So what you're trying to do is to limit the amount of damage they can do. Now, of course, they can go underground. And I teach this thing at Michigan and all around the world that I'm really well known for called How to Win a Bar Fight. It's a terrible term, but remember, I'm from a blue collar neighborhood. I came to college as a wrestler. I got through it as a Teamster, right? And the notion is there's a way to basically take these negative people and neutralize them. And it's sort of a whole stream. But in order to do that, you have to understand how organizations actually work, right? What the organizational model is so that you're not doing damage. You're not an aggressive person. It's like a keto. It's like when they attack, here's how you deflect it, right? Here's how the organization does this. So that basically they're neutralizing themselves. And I don't like this negative kind of discussion because I think most people you can bring along, right? It's only a very rare person who's kind of in this very caustic black hole kind of place.
Bringing in the larger culture into it, bringing in the larger mission, vision, and all that. What is corporate culture's role when it comes to adaptability, when it comes to creating an environment?
I'm going to say something that's very controversial, particularly being where I'm at the University of Michigan, which is famous for this. I don't believe in culture the way people talk about it. Culture isn't a thing. It's an attribute of things like beauty or quality, right? So when we talk about culture, it doesn't exist as a thing. Culture exists in two ways that are profound. Culture exists in how leaders lead, and culture exists in how we work. So those are the two things. And if you don't believe that, what's the first thing we do when we acquire an underperforming company? You slot out the leaders because that's where the culture is emanating from. And if you've got a high-performing company, you golden handcuffs, you try and hang on to that person for a while, right? So culture is really an aspect of leadership. It's really not separate from leadership. So I want to start with that. And then the second thing I want to start with is that culture is how you work, right? Do you listen to other people? Are you creating momentum? Do people get to have, variations? Are you working through paradoxes, right? That's what makes those cultures like this. So I have a great story around this. When I was a very young man, I was advisor to Apple, but way too young to be part of this. There was a guy named Mike Muller who was one of the original Apple guys, and he was a German guy who had an English car, and he would drive his car, the wheel on the wrong side, up and down 401, scared the dickens out of me. And he'd take me to places, and he'd go, what do you think of this company? And I was trying to be smart. I think I'm like 25 at the time. Oh, this is great. They have good strategy. He goes, I'd never invest in it. And, it'd be an IBM company or something. And after about the third time, I'm kind of catching on and getting sandbagged here, right? So he finally takes me to this company, and it feels like chaos to me, but you can just feel the place hum. And so now I'm catching on, and I'm like, okay, this feels like a company that's moving, that's got a culture, that people are doing stuff. They're exhibiting self-authorizing behavior. They're probably making tons of mistakes. Well, that company was Oracle, right? Which, of course, becomes this great company. But the point that he understood that I didn't understand as a young man was when you see that kind of work, right? We're putting this name culture on it, but it could work in a million different ways. It doesn't have to be, crazy entrepreneurial culture. That, to me, how you work tells me everything about what the culture is. And one of the things I learned building Domino's Pizza was, you watch some kid who was 16 years old in a hot day in Washington, run up the road, and you'd go, that's culture, right? For some reason, that young person thinks that it's important to get his pizza to somebody. It's 30 minutes, right? So I hope I'm making sense about this. So when people do these big culture change programs, there's very little evidence that these things work, right? The way culture change really works is you change the leaders, right? Or you change how the leaders lead, which of course, a lot of times is really the key, and you change how it works. Now, the one thing I will say that really supports where you're going with this, Russell, is this. When we start looking at dynastic organizations that have scale and are sustainable, there's three things that they have, and it's not technology. They have the culture, the competencies, and the communities that are sustainable. So you look at the University of Chicago down the road. It's been around for about 130 years, has 101 Nobel Prize winners, right? Lots of conflict, but constructive. Sometimes not, but mostly yes. Sometimes it spills out into the journals and there's a little pushing and shoving, but it's all polite. And you look at this and go, okay, how is it every time that there's a whole new trend or something goes in very different? How come they're on top of it? Right? And the same thing if you look at technology in Carnegie Mellon or MIT, or you look, right, or Michigan, right? You start seeing that leadership piece that sits at the center of this, that what your listeners are supposed to be doing, that leadership piece of modeling, of giving that energy, of bringing these differences together in a way that's purposeful, that matters. If I can give you an example of something I worked on. So behind me, I have a patch from the United States government. I worked on the COVID vaccine, not the actual vaccine, but how do we get 1 billion vials and how do you get 1 billion needles? And what was interesting about that to me was at the beginning, they had a very clear way of trying to do this, which clearly didn't work. And it was really, getting called into that was not a lot of fun. But the concept very quickly became these small shots on goal. We had almost 500 of them that went into phase 1 of the Food and Drug Administration of the United States, which is how we do things here. And very quickly, we're drawing them down into 169 phase 2s. And we had 9 therapies that were temporary, provisionally approved in 7 months. We took a 7-year process and did it in 7 months. And the reason that worked is once we got to this part where we had 500 shots on goal, we had our culture, we had our competencies in that group, and we had our community, and we had one thing that held everything together. We had a goal. We had a shared goal. We had one vision. So the chaos, remember the press said we forgot how to do this and we all took our stupid pills, and we didn't. The chaos was held together by this vision. And more as we drew down, there were these impresarios, these people who hold these communities together, who deeply understand the width, not just the depth of these communities, but how these communities interrelate. And more as we got to the middle of this, it became an issue of who can hold these communities together.
I love that you're doubling down on the importance of vision, mission, and goals. Because adaptability, you can adapt and look for those opportunities all you like, but if there's not that bought in, clear direction. I remember going to a conference once and he told everybody to close their eyes and point north. Everybody pointed in not a million different directions, but a lot of different directions. Then he said, open your eyes, north is that way. Okay, now everybody point north. And everybody was all together pointing in the same direction. But we just assume people know these things. We don't spend the time and the communication and the effort. We just put it on a poster or a website. How much have you, I love that example of we had one goal. Our culture fed the goal. Why don't leaders take visions and missions more seriously?
Oh, from your lips to God's ears. I would say a couple things though about this. I'd say a vision is a work in progress. A vision is like being an explorer where you're Lewis and Clark. You haven't been here before. You build the Canadian Railroad, whatever metaphor you want to use. So there's two parts to it. You need to be listening. Your vision can't be, it's not a heroic vision. This whole idea of it came fully formed from my forehead like Athena is nonsense, right? You're listening to the people who are worth listening to. Now, this is the first important part that you're getting at. Russell, you're right on this, which is know who knows. Stop listening to people. Every idiot has an opinion on things, and and some of them are the most popular people on the web. Stop listening to people who don't know, right? Tell me what in your experience, doesn't have to be education, one of your experience qualifies you to make a comment about this. I know that I went to high school with this kid who lived behind me who flunked biology sitting next to me. And during the COVID, it was all the Mr. Anti-vaxxer. I'm like, well, if you were, an epidemiologist or something, or virologist, I might listen to you, but you flunked biology. You don't even understand how this works. So you're probably not somebody worth listening to. So step one, do listen, but know your blind spots and know who to listen to. Step two, the second piece of that is listen to your scouts who are at the edge of the circle, because they'll give you confirming or disconfirming feedback where you're wrong. So being the captain isn't just we're going here. It's navigating. And incidentally, some of the best captains, and I'm using the pronoun him or some of the best captains I've ever met are women. So just remember, this is not everybody is capable of doing this. Everybody in the whole world. And I have experiences with all of that. So that becomes key, right? That whole navigation piece.
So if I'm listening to this, wrapping up, we're almost out of time. I can't believe that. So we have someone listening going, okay, I want to be more adaptable so I can find those opportunities, so I can go down that path. What are they starting to do, Jeff? Like, what is the first thing they're doing tomorrow to sort of lead down the path of being intentionally adaptable for those opportunities?
Yeah, three things right off the bat. The past is the past. It's all going forward right now, right? That's key. Make paradox your practice. The concept that I think is so important is that paradoxes and ambiguity and incongruity they're not things that are to be worked through for change. They are the change. They are the essence of the change. And if you don't have ambiguity, paradox, or incongruities, you're not changing. You're making iterations to what you're doing. You're still in X marks the spot. And then I think the whole idea of all of this is to start with inquiry, not with content. I mean, the notion is, are you starting like this? Are you starting like this? Are you a learner? Learning, in my opinion, learning and innovation or learning and change are inextricably combined. It's all about, building the bridge as you walk over it. Are you learning as you do this? And if you're not getting any smarter doing it, you're probably not swimming out far enough. So, and again, this is where I'm a terrible hypocrite. I will tell you that I'm very uncomfortable swimming way out, and yet I swim way out every day. Why? Because it's the only way, right? So it's like eating your broccoli, or I don't want people to make it sound like it's all great and heroic and I'm going to love it, because you're not. But the notion is what you're going to love is that your abilities are going to greatly expand doing that. You're going to meet different kinds of people. You're going to know you can solve different challenges. And that's my favorite thing, Russell, of all of this, is when somebody figures out that they have an ability, like a super skill that they didn't know they had. I'm like, it was there the whole time.
That is Jeff DeGraff. He is a advisor for Fortune 500 companies, top speaker on innovation, professor as he's sitting right now at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. And he's the founder of Innovatrium, which creates sustainable innovation ecosystem for large organizations. And he's a prolific writer, but his latest book he co-authored called The Creative Mindset, Mastering the 6 Skills That Empower Innovation. Thank you so much for being here, Jeff.
Thanks for having me on, Russell. I appreciate it.
That's it. We are done and scene. I never took drama, but I always found that funny. That'll do it for another episode of Relationships at Work, the leadership podcast helping you build workplace connection, improve culture, and avoid blind spots. I'm Russell. I'm here every week with you, and I love it. I absolutely love doing this. 2 episodes per week. Every Monday, we come out with a guest episode, and usually Thursday, is a mini episode, 10 minutes or less, quick, valuable bits of information, just to help you with a nudge, maybe think a little differently, or reinforce leadership directions, priorities that you already know, but maybe haven't thought about in a while. That's the intent of the mini episodes. But these guest episodes have been, well, my brain's a little bit bigger for them, and I hope you're getting tons of value out of it as well. I'd love to hear your feedback too. If you think the podcast could be better in some ways, or you really like me to double down in certain areas, reach out to me. hello@russellolliker.com. My name's Russell with 1 L, and my last name's Lolliker, Lola and Cher put together. hello@russellolliker.com. I've used that joke before, but believe me, it really helps with remembering. Okay, we'll leave it there with sort of a reach out to you so I can hear from you, because that's what this is. It's a community. It's a way of interacting with each other. So I'd love to hear from you on how I could be better serving you. Okay, take care, and we'll talk to you again soon.